Thank you very much. Thank you for that very lengthy introduction. Sometimes there's things we write so we can get some funds from the government, and they find themselves in presentations like these. Welcome everyone to this great conference, albeit reasonably small, but nonetheless we have, from what I saw in the proceedings, some very, very great speakers and some excellent presentations, particularly around the technology. What I'm going to do today is I'm not going to talk a lot about technology, so we'll warm up to the technology and the great papers that will follow. I'll talk a little bit about big data in general and how might we be able to map our big data initiatives to convince our masters and the people that are providing the support for the big data initiatives to actually invest and continue the great work in this space. I plan to cover what are some of the drivers of big data. I think you most of you know of the drivers, so it's very much, let's say, a little bit of a warm-up revision on that. Talk a little bit about some of the big data myths, and what the industry is saying where big data is actually moving towards. What is the advice around mapping your big data strategy, and what are some of the challenges around big data? There is no doubt that more and more on a daily basis we are becoming more and more interconnected, more intelligent, and certainly instrumented in every way. I think that when we began some of the work around big data quite a while now, terms such as big data, a very unfortunate term in fact, but nonetheless phrases and terms like big data were foreign to most people. And the Internet of Things, which has emerged only in the last 2 or 3 years, now Cisco calls it the Internet of Everything, is in fact an area that is really going to be truly transformational in the way that IT and our world operates. It's going to basically monitor and identify and produce data about everything that we do, every activity and every location that we are visiting will be and is already in many ways tracked by sensor technology, by mobile devices the world over. So I remember only 2 or 3 years ago we were talking about the sensors, embedded sensors, being as numerous as the population of this earth. And we were saying how in a couple of years' time we will have 15 billion sensors. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, now people are saying that in the next 2 or 3 years we're going to reach 50 billion sensors in basically all sorts of areas, embedded in just about every activity and monitor just about every activity that we do. So all of that will be sources of more data, more often in real time, and certainly from a large variety of sources. I will not mention the dreaded 3 V's that everyone talks about, but that is true. That is what is happening in terms of the variety of the data that we are collecting and the sheer torrents of data that are coming to organizations these days. And even very few, I think 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, I remember there were some statistics that were saying 70% of data is not used. Gartner and others were actually citing examples of most organizations not using the data that they had. So imagine now what is happening was a lot of the data is coming in, and yet we have difficulty in making sense quickly enough for us to actually be able to get some actionable insights. In fact, I saw somewhere where, I read somewhere where the NSA, probably one of the biggest data gatherers in the world, is collecting so much data that it's becoming a problem for it. It's becoming an issue because they cannot make decisions enough, because they are just basically drowned in that data. So there is a lot of what I call Hadoopalooza, a lot of stuff, a lot of technologies, a lot of sometimes hype, but not always, right? A lot of technologies are coming out to deal with this new infrastructure. We had to develop and design and invent new technologies to cope with the variety and the volumes of data that we had. So there are all sorts of terms that we in the ICT had to learn, and no doubt people like you are already experts in possibly not all of these technologies, because you couldn't be, but certainly in some of these technologies. And from what I saw in the proceedings, it would be very interesting to see the work that you are doing around the cloud, around the technologies such as Hadoop and so on. But nonetheless, the majority of the people, and most importantly management, most importantly the sponsors, are reasonably confused about this area. They say, yes, it is important, I guess, to be in a big data initiative, but a lot of times they do it because others are doing it, and they are moving into an area where they are beginning to spend money in the same way as we spent money on e-commerce many years ago. The hype around e-commerce and big data has a significant parallel. And in fact, it's very much governed by the Gartner cycles, in fact. But sometimes what we need to do is to ensure that we have enough information to convince management not to think that all of it is hype. Because in the same way as e-commerce, not all of it was hyped, then big data, of course, is not hype as well. No doubt you've seen many definitions about big data, but I like these three. And perhaps even a fourth one if we're going to move into the IoT as well. And the fourth one is that basically big data is a virtual trail of physical reality, right? Because we are so instrumented, interconnected, and connected into an environment that anything we do, we leave a vapor trail after us. But most people would say that the big data, originally at least, and that is why the guys at Yahoo began with HDFS, MapReduce, and the paper that they started, I think it was about 10 years ago. It was a problem for them because they were ingesting the entire internet every day. So they had to do something. They couldn't possibly rely on the traditional systems, storage repositories that they had. So it was a problem. The volume, variety, velocity of the generated data began to stress the systems. That's fine, but it's also a capability, right? And that's why big data is kind of a little bit of an unfortunate term, because it says too much and too little. But nonetheless, we can view it as a capability in the organization where we can collect data and extract more value out of it, use more of the data we capture and use, and squeeze more value out of it as well. And it's also an opportunity for us to optimize processes and certainly to enhance decision making. If you ask many top leaders in the C-suite, they will tell you until now that they still make gut feel decisions. They still do not subscribe, not because they don't want to, but because they don't have enough data and insights to make evidence-based decisions. And that's where we need to be moving towards, let alone actually developing new business models and monetizing the data that's there, which is probably requires higher degrees of innovation and higher degrees of maturity. And it's interesting that a lot of the organizations that have those capabilities are not the innovators that actually start the new disruptive innovations. It's so interesting. Uber, for instance, you'd think that some bigger organization would, rather than a few guys in the garage or whatever they were in the kitchen, start Uber and other organizations like that. You'd think Zipcar, for instance, someone like Avis or Hertz would do that, but of course they wouldn't, because it's a competitor to their own business model. So there is innovation everywhere. I've just come back from Shenzhen in China, and I was fortunate enough to visit the headquarters of Huawei. And I was told that Shenzhen has 1 million startups. 1 million startups. Can you imagine that? 1 million startup companies in one city. Large one, but well, probably as big as Australia and more, I think. But anyway, perhaps you may prefer this definition. Big data is like teenage sex. Everybody talks about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks that everyone else is doing it, so they are doing it too. This is funny, and maybe it's funny to you, maybe it's not. But actually, there is a lot of sheep mentality in the way that organizations are really operating. And that has happened in many areas, in big data. In e-commerce and other areas, we had the same type of thing. That is, hey, my competitor is into e-commerce, maybe we should be in it too. Oh, there's a big organization, small organization here. That business model that they're presenting seem to make sense, but we haven't done the proper business case for it. Yes, we'll invest a few million. So there was a lot of froth in the beginning, and so too there was, and still is, a bit of froth around big data. But we have to be careful not to think that big data is just all froth. It's not, it's real. And indeed, there are some reports out there that if you do have a big data initiative, it is likely to be well ahead as a competitor against your competitors in terms of performance. 5 to 6% better is what Gartner says. So big data is not real, is what the myth is. It's all just hype. I know that you know that, particularly because you are in this conference, that it is not a myth. And in fact, I'm sure that many of you will be very keen to hear what you say. Many of you are very interested in and involved in some of the real stuff at big data. Hadoop is all there is to big data. Hadoop has been and still is, and particularly around the new players now that are providing Hadoop even as a cloud service. In fact, I think that Cloudera, for instance, is what Red Hat was to Linux, is what Cloudera was to Hadoop. It provides you that solution so that you don't have to worry about starting from scratch in terms of building your Hadoop information infrastructure. But it's not only about Hadoop, okay? And of course now there is a proliferation of open source and other technologies that are moving. Everyone else is doing more than us. We are behind. Many organizations tend to kind of panic about that. Well, in fact, the truth is that most organizations, there are some innovators and there are some people that are doing some really cool stuff and getting some return on their investment, but the majority are moving very slowly, and the majority are, hopefully, are moving steadily towards, some of them, failure. Gartner, a recent report of Gartner estimate of all of the current big data initiatives are likely to fail by 2017. Fail meaning fail to be implemented, fail to go to production, okay? Because that, not unfortunately, it is a fortunate thing, but big data is kind of different. It's a different paradigm, both in the way that the project is established and the way that you would actually derive results out of it. Big data is not like traditional software initiative, mostly software projects. There is a high element of exploration, a high element of experimentation with big data. And by definition, when you have experimentation, much of it will fail. But the things that win are likely to give you significant results, significant value. Whereas with traditional IT, even though 70% still failed, they weren't experiments, right? They failed for many reasons, but they weren't experiments. You had a good map of where you were supposed to be going with traditional. Given that we have so much data, the quality of the data is not as important. And indeed, that is something that a lot of people are saying. And in some ways, that could be true. Because with big data, you don't have to worry about sampling and sampling errors. You have the population. You analyze all of the data. However, when you take data from one repository, usually not one, a multitude of repositories, and you put them in something like a data lake, for instance, and you do some analysis and experimentation on that data, when you have lost some of the semantic information that has come from that data, you run a big risk of getting results that may not necessarily be of much value, and indeed in some ways detrimental to you. So data quality, and then also more importantly, also information governance in general around the privacy and the security is a big area that a lot of people now are thinking about. Technology can fix the integration issues. Of course, technology can fix many of the integration issues, and we are moving very fast in that space, but not all of them. In fact, one of the biggest challenges, the three biggest challenges that most people are reporting with big data are in that order: squeezing value out of the big data initiative, in other words, delivering something of value to the organization, because they're not going to feed you forever. You know, they'll give you some because someone else is doing it, as we said about the teenage sex. They'll give you some funding, they'll initiate a project, but you're not going to have the funding forever. You have to actually produce some results, and results very quickly. So business value is number one. Governance issue is number two. And bringing disparate data together, integration issues in other words, is number three in terms of the great challenges of big data today. And of course, data warehouses would be eliminated by distributed computing and data lakes, etc., etc. Well, I read some Gartner reports and others, in fact, in Boston Consulting. I think it was only as, 5 years ago, and Gartner was convinced. I was at the Gartner Forum in Los Angeles, and many of the VPs are saying, the information management VPs were saying, the data warehouse is gone, it's a dinosaur, it's finished. And the probability was 0.8. You know how Gartner puts a probability score around around all of the predictions? It was 0.8. For Gartner, that's very high. And yet 5 years later, the same people are saying, well, actually, 90% of data warehouses will stay. Because, you know, it's not about throwing the old bits out and coming with the new bits. It's not all about, you know, distributed computing. I think the structured information, we have gone through a very long and arduous journey to get the maturity of structured data, structured information in order, and that will not be eliminated. But it will be augmented in a big way with the new technologies. It is though, and it's interesting because people have been talking about information being, and data and information, it's really information that is more important, but information being a valuable asset for a long time, 30, 40 years. For as long as we've been talking about computers, we've been talking about information being valuable. But actually, we've only been talking the talk. we have not been paying a lot of attention to data. And it's only today that information management as a role is even coming into the radar. In the past, if you actually were an information manager in an organization, that possibly meant you're a librarian. That possibly meant you're someone who was taking all the documents and filing them somewhere. The role has changed significantly, and so it should, because it is all about information. It's all about creating information asymmetries. That's what you're doing with every big data initiative, is you're trying to create an information asymmetry. You're trying to have more information about something, whether it's the stock exchange, whether it's fraud management, whatever it is, than I have. And if you do that, you then have CA. You then have the competitive advantage. So, even as luminaries, I don't know if we quote Bill Gates, but I think what he said there is great as far as the distance and the distance between you and your competitors is very much centered around information. So how do we start? And that's one area that not a lot has been written even today. If you Google technologies for big data, if you Google big data as a general term, you're going to get millions of actual documents and returns on your Google. If you Google strategic management, if you Google strategic plan for, in other words, how do I actually start with big data, there is still not quite a lot of knowledge out there in that space. And organizations are still not as mature as they are with normal strategic planning in that space. Not that the two are significantly different, but there are some differences. I think the most important thing is to start, right? Many Chinese philosophers, many Greek philosophers, many philosophers from all over the place have said, right, half of a long journey is starting that journey, right? Or something like that. Now, when I say that, well, only a couple of years ago, there were about 30 people in various surveys that go out there. There were only about 30% of the organizations that had no big data initiative and no intention of starting in the next 12 months. This year's surveys have gone down to 12%. It's only about 12% that say, in the next 12 months, we don't have a big data initiative, and in the next 12 months, we're not likely to start. Well, everything is actually starting. So the first step is already taken. But then the most important thing is to focus. By the way, I'll make these slides available to anyone who wants to. Focus on something that is tangible. I say that because we've done a lot of work around the business, developing the business case. Now, it's very important to develop the business case around big data, because the ROI is very difficult to measure. And in fact, in many ways, it's almost crazy to measure it, because when it comes to innovation, when it comes to research for something new, you really don't know what you're going to find until you find it, and even then you don't know how valuable it is until you test it. So it's very difficult. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean you have a license to experiment forever. Yeah, it just means that you've got to be able to pick your low-hanging fruit, if you like. Pick something in the organization that starts the journey with big data, but in a way that you will get some tangible results, so that you can satisfy particularly the chief financial officer, who doesn't get that innovation as much as the chief innovation officer, for instance, which is normally the CIO, or it should be the CIO. So a lot of people have gone around, okay, the first thing to do is sales and marketing. That makes sense, right? Because there's so much social media out there, and so many technologies that can analyze what we are saying about our behaviors, our preferences, the products we buy and use, that actually the social media data is very important, very easy to get. These guys in the marketing are pretty astute in terms of actually getting technologies to do things and to make marketing better. So that is a good area to be working on, and many are. Operational and financial performance efficiencies is also another area that's very important. Risk and compliance, New products and service, that's where the innovations aspects are coming in. And of course, data monetization, which is far more difficult and possibly only available to some of the larger organizations. Very quickly, because I don't even know how we're going with time. I've only given 30 minutes. Is someone going to give me a warning? No. Take evolutionary steps towards a new information infrastructure. Your biggest challenge will be skills. Okay, is that true? I mean, the people that are kind of who is involved in the big data initiative? Can you put your hand up? Okay, a few. The people that are involved, is skills a problem? I guess some of you are academics and professors and technical people, so you are the people that I think who was it? Davenport said the sexiest job of the 21st century will be a data scientist, right? So the moment I saw that, I said, now there is an opportunity. I went to SAS, you know, the SAS, the analytics company, and we crafted the second degree at the Master of Data Science in Australia. We're offering a Master of Data Science online in collaboration with SAS, and we've had very good results. But in terms of trying to fill in what the opportunities will be there, is we will not even be able to make a significant impact. There's going to be a lot of jobs for very, very good people in this space, in the data science area. So the skills is a very big challenge. Technology is a silver bullet, okay? It has not worked in the past. You know, you probably have seen things like CRM in 90 days. Oh yeah, big deal. CRM in 90 days in a big organization, do you think you can do that? Of course you can. You know, ERP in 90 days. In fact, why make it in 90 days? 1 month. In 1 month you can get SAP, right? Get the disks and whatever you get it, however. And it's all done. You just turnkey, yeah? No, because it's like the iceberg, you know. The little bit on the top is very small, but all the bits underneath. The hard bits are the organizational process re-engineering, the culture, all of these things, the people issues, all of that are far more important than the actual software. So the technology is important, but there's no silver bullet there. Like all human activity, planning is essential. So develop a plan, right? Because planning is essential. It's important to actually develop a strategic plan for big data. I have 5 minutes left. Wow. Okay, 4 important elements. Data is important. Analytic models are very, very important, okay? And you need to actually see how they would be linked to other analytic models to develop what a lot of people are calling analytics factories. The tools, okay? You need to understand the tools, okay? The tools and how you're going to integrate it. Because it's okay to play in the sandbox. It's okay to get some insights and say, oh yes, there is a correlation here with this variable and so on. But then moving that to production is a big, big challenge. It's not as easy as that. And of course, skills will be important. I only have 5 minutes. Perhaps I should say, highlight a distinction between the two. The two meaning the traditional initiatives. And then the traditional initiatives, you had a compass, you had a map, you knew where you were going, right? You actually spent a lot of time in user requirements. You knew what the user wanted, you knew what the project was about, it was highly specified, you were very mature in your project management processes, and everything was great. And you worked according to budget and on time, you delivered everything. Who cares about whether you delivered any benefits, right? Well, you did actually. Most IT, the benefits are not as easily seen, but they are there. And in some cases, they're very easy to measure. But in big data, that's even worse. That's even more difficult. Because in big data, you don't have a map, you don't have a compass, you don't know where you're going because it's very much uncharted territory. No one else has been there before. And therefore, you have to kind of say, well, I'm an explorer here. Here I'm an explorer. But someone is paying me to be an explorer, and that check will not be coming every month unless I send something back, unless I find, you know, the cities of gold that they were looking for in America. So what you need to do is to balance exploration with exploitation, right? You need to look at the data now. Start with your data, big or small, who cares? Start with your data, do a better job with your data, and begin to exploit it more than you are doing at the moment. And of course, at the same time, have some exploration initiative where you are trying to look. Start with a customer. All of us have customers, whether we call them customers, patients, jail inmates, whatever they are, they're all customers. Right? Whoever you are serving, start with them and say, how can I do a better job for them? And then develop, explore, find some insights from your data, and then exploit quickly. In doing so, you need to ask questions. And indeed, one of the biggest problems in big data analytics initiatives is framing the question. This is what Einstein said. He said that if I basically had an hour, I would only spend 5 minutes on the solution. 55 minutes would be trying to frame and understand the question. Once you've done that, it's much easier then to get an emerging solution. Okay? Up to now, it's the 2 bullets we've been working on. And that's great. That's BI. Right? What has happened, the descriptive, and why did it happen, the diagnostic. But there with big data, we have the opportunity to also be predictive and prescriptive as well. And in doing so, Rumsfeld, infamous quote here, back in 2002, during the Gulf War, I think it was, there are known knowns. These are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. There are unknown knowns and unknown unknowns. If we put this, this is sourced, by the way, to a good friend and colleague of mine, Joe Pepper. He's an adjunct professor at my university, was previously at Cranfield and now at the European School of IT, Management and IT, and developed a framework, if you like, with the questions being defined or undefined, and the data being known or unknown. And the known knowns are your traditional stuff. You know what you're going to be asking. You know, the sales for the Singapore region, right? The shoe sales, or whatever it may be. That's the dashboards, the reports that you get. But you also have you know the question, but you don't actually have the data yet. You want to test to see whether this little product is going to sell in the market. So you know what you're going to test, but you don't have the data, right? So that's, the data is unknown as yet. You go out and get it. Sometimes you don't know the question, but you do know, you do have the data, like Rolls-Royce is an example. What Rolls-Royce does is for every time you fly an aeroplane with a Rolls-Royce engine, it collects all the sensor data from the engines and sends it to Derby in the UK and analyzes that data. It doesn't quite know yet what it analyzes. It would have some idea, but it just keeps getting the data and then will develop the questions. What Google does is the unknown unknowns. In other words, we don't know what the questions are and we don't know the data, what the data is yet. And as you know, Google collects everything. When Google collected the data, it never occurred to it that it will make the best dictionary in the world, spelling checker in the world. It didn't occur to it. Not only that, but it made it in 170 different languages as well. Right? That's what most people call dark data. Right? Data that we have that we don't even know what it's about. We don't know yet what it tells us. But that's where the opportunity is. Lots of landfill, a bit like Australian mining. Lots of soil and landfill, but then once you shift it, you'll get some golden nuggets. And out of golden nuggets will come, in other words, that's where the exploration will take place, and you'll get the insights to give you then something that is of value, and if it's of value, you put it into, you operationalize it to give you the results. Some of the critical success factors, I'm sorry, Ellie. Identifiable business value, you just have to have that, right? If you don't have that, yeah, you probably won't go past your first big data initiative because, you know, people around the big table will say, oh, gee, we spent enough money on this. Top management commitment is important. as long as you identify number one, there's no problem with number two. Data science skills, technical, quantitative, and business. A lot of you are technologists, great, that's fantastic. You also need, for a data scientist, you also need to actually work with or have the business skills to know how to actually support the value bit that we talk about. Balance, exploration and exploitation, and paying attention to the hard, soft issues, because meaning the change management, meaning those types of issues that are. And of course, if you torture your data enough, it will basically tell you anything. So you've got to be careful with that, because a lot of times we find a lot of different links, a lot of different correlations, and you say, aha, I've discovered something here, but it may not be what it seems. It's a bit like this, right? Inspector Clouseau says, does your dog bite? The hotel clerk says, no. Inspector Clouseau bowing down to pet the dog. Nice doggy. Dog bites Clouseau. I thought you said the dog didn't bite. That's not my dog. Right? Can you see the perspective that I mean that you're going to have? Thanks very much. I'm sorry that I was late.